If Christ is king, how should the Christian consider the kingdoms of this world? What does the Bible teach us about human authority and what it means to love our neighbors and our enemies? Before we render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, let's know what it means to render unto God what is God's. This is the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, the modern prophetic voice against war and empire.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. This week and every week on Biblical Anarchy, we seek to live counterculture to the empire of man and to instead seek the kingdom of God by unpacking what the Bible teaches about government, authority, and human relationships. I am your host, Jacob Winograd. So for today's episode, you're going to get a little bit of a return to tradition here on the Biblical Anarchy Podcast. I feel like lately my style and format for the episodic entries of my Biblical Anarchy venture here at the Libertarian Christian Institute have been, not to downplay them or to talk badly of them. Rather, I've been happy with the turn of direction in terms of putting a lot of work into those numeric episodes, the more official entries, as opposed to the live streams that I do. Putting a lot of research into them, providing you with a lot of quotes from both scripture and from different theologians and church history, diving into specific debates within Christian theology or politics or economics, things like that. And so lately I've been having a lot of notes and things to reference when I do an episode. But when I first started, I used to just kind of wing it. And that's what we're doing today. Is I have something that I want to talk about. And I have some notes I could reference, but I suppose this is one of those episodes where I have things that I want to say. And although these things are going to be said in upcoming episodes where I'm going to be talking about eschatology more, where I'm going to be talking about covenant theology and looking more into the Mosaic Law and the place it has within the tapestry of Scripture. Although I'm going to touch on a lot of what I want to talk about today in those episodes, it's not necessarily going to be in like saying everything I want to say in one sitting. Rather, it'll be kind of like what I'm going to say here is going to be supported and then built upon and fortified in upcoming episodes that I do have planned. So think of this as sort of a, I don't know, like if you attend a style church like I do, where the pastor will kind of create a sermon series, and then but at the beginning, you're going to have sort of the opening. Here is the series that we're going to do, right? So I'm going to be talking about sort of a general theme that I want to shift towards talking about, and that a lot of future episodes are going to be aimed at, but I'm going to kind of set the stage for that here in this episode. So the topic, I guess, is also hard to give a single sentence summary of, but in general, it's my thoughts on some of the tendencies I see from the Christian right at the moment. The last few episodes, I feel like I've been punching left more. And I feel like over this past year, I've been punching left more than I punch right. And I guess there's a lot of reasons for that. I tend to see a lot more in our society, especially over the last 20 years, and then personally in terms of my witness, in terms of coming from the left. I've often been just reacting to the left more than I react to the right. And I think I do generally believe that the left seems to be motivated more by things I find to be pernicious and evil, and the right I've tended to find motivated more by things that I agree with in terms of the spirit that's driving them, and I think they're misguided in terms of their application or a lack of understanding of certain theological, political, or economic truths. That trend, maybe that general mindset, is still in effect, I think, but I'm starting to notice a pattern on the right. And it's not maybe the right as a whole, but through my interactions with a lot of the, I guess, the dissident right. Because the right is just like the left, not a monolith. And I don't know if the way that I'm conceptualizing or dividing the right up is maybe the most accurate way. I suppose maybe some people would do it differently, and maybe I could be persuaded theirs is better. But I guess in my mind, you have a few different camps, right? You have the neoconservative side of the right, which is sort of what I grew up in sort of that was sort of like the prevailing attitude and ideology on the right. Sort of why I became a lefty was because I hated the neoconservative mindset. I hated the military interventionism. I hated the sort of perversion of Christianity, the sort of like Americanized, very westernized view of Christianity. It was a very shallow, at best, understanding of Christianity. And I didn't like how the neoconservative mindset tended towards a sort of like superiority complex and a sort of looking down upon different people groups. And so, I mean, I'm not here to give an exhaustive definition of neoconservatism, but that's one prevailing camp. I guess I think of your Lindsey Grahams, your sort of your Ben Shapiros, your George Bushes, your John McCain's, right? And then you have, I guess, the center right. And there's a lot of people who would consider themselves Republican or right-leaning conservatives, but they tend to be very moderate. And so they probably just have general beliefs about, like, you know, probably like not quite libertarianism, but somewhere in the realm of like classical liberalism. So they might not be motivated by the same sort of like American exceptionalism that your neocons tend to be motivated by. And sometimes the center right will move a little bit into, like, you see a lot of overlap with the center left. And you even see this from like former libertarians. Like I think of people like Joshua Eagle, who is, I think, one of the founders of the Liberal Party, or at least he's part of the Liberal Party, and he's a former Republican, and then he spent time in the Libertarian Party as well. But he's kind of like, he's not quite, and I know some of my audience who's familiar with him will maybe disagree with me, and on X, it's very common on social media to, I don't know, be as uncharitable as possible. And fair enough. I mean, Joshua has certainly earned some of that, but I guess from my Christian perspective, I'm going to turn the other cheek and be charitable towards him, even if maybe there's not much justification for that in some people's eyes. I've had always a good relationship with Joshua as well, so maybe that plays into it. I have strong disagreements with him, but he's someone who fits this archetype, which is why I'm bringing it up, because he's not quite a neocon. Like, there's obviously, if you're going to put Joshua Eagle next to Ben Shapiro, even though there's certain policy prescriptions they would agree on, there's not necessarily the same motivating force. So they're both going to sort of support American activism, like an active American foreign policy, and thinking that, you know, there's a role for things like NATO and international cooperation, but it's not necessarily the same spirit that's motivating that sort of, I don't know, like we call it war hawkishness with neocons. With people like Equal, it's more of like a globalist mindset, which I wouldn't really ascribe a globalist mindset to a Ben Shapiro, but I wouldn't call Joshua Equal a leftist, because he's still, you know, at least somewhat on the side of free markets and not super totalitarian, you know, governments, not central planning. So there's a lot of people who are like center right. And this is where like a lot of the never Trumpers came from. I guess there's overlap between neocons and the center right and the never Trumpers, but it's not all like one to one, I guess is what I'm saying. Then there are the dissident right. And the dissident right, maybe by the nature of the fact that they're dissident, is not even a monolith themselves. There's almost a separate breakdown that has to be done. It's a, so it's a schism within a schism. On the dissident right, you have of course your MAGA, and then the Make America Great, the Trumpers, kind of like the populist side of the right, and then, although again, there's always going to be crossover and overlap. There are the like really dissident right, like they go harder than your MAGA, and I guess this would be like your Groypers, your Nick Fuentes types, and the Christian nationalists, I would say, fall in this camp as well as I guess the paleoconservatives, although that's like all 12 paleoconservatives. I'm sure there's a lot of paleoconservative people, but in terms of like just popular, active, well-known, influential paleoconservatives, it's unfortunately the minority. Most of them exist. There's people in the Mises Institute. There's like Paul Gottfried, who I actually like. There's the I know Stephen Wolfe, who I've had on my show, is a paleocon who also is a Christian nationalist. So again, a lot of overlap between a lot of these different groups for sure. But I guess what I want to talk about in today's episode is a little bit more focusing on the dissident right, especially the Christian nationalists. And again, there's not even one type of Christian nationalist. I've interacted with Eastern Orthodox Christian nationalists. I've interacted with the Catholic ones, the Reformed theonomist ones, and then Wolfe is almost this unique breed of Reformed, non-theonomist, non-Kuyperian, but still Christian nationalist. And it's very, Wolfe is a very fascinating character. I've talked about Wolfe a lot, including reviews of his books, along with Alex Bernardo, and we obviously covered Christian nationalism at Freedom Fest last year, 2023. And I hope to have Wolfe back on the show at some point. We've been having some scheduling conflicts, and I'm sure we'll work it out at some point. So again, and even with like Andrew Wilson, who I've interacted with, there's a lot of these people who, like, I'm not necessarily here to demonize them. Certainly there are times where they post things and say things that I have very strong disagreements with. The last two episodes, I was responding to Hody Johns, who is more, I guess what people would classify as a Christian progressive, and more, people might call him left libertarian. I mean, he's certainly socially liberal, but he's definitely more of a, on the capitalist free market side economically. And just all this to say that I have a lot of friendships and good relationships with people of varying beliefs, and I'll have friends who look at people like Stephen Wolfe and go, ooh, he said really reprehensible things. And then I'll have people look at my friendship with Hody and go, oh, he said really reprehensible or, heretical things or things like that. And I don't find it helpful in my just personal life to, draw hard lines with people for disagreements of things of this nature. I treat people the way that they treat me. And ultimately, I have relationships with people I have strong disagreements with because I don't want to live in an echo chamber. And I do want to be able to have positive interactions with people from different worldviews and camps. And so if I can have a good relationship with a Stephen Wolfe or a Hody Johns, I'm going to do that. I might have a agenda of trying to change their minds, and I'm sure they have an agenda of trying to change my minds too. And also, let's just take a minute here before I really dive into the meat of what I want to talk about here. Because there are some things you kind of want to say that don't always, like, it's not going to be a whole episode, right? But it fits into the context here. I get really annoyed by this sort of like, what's the right way to describe this? The sort of demonization of association. And it's kind of like what the left does, but I see the right doing it too very often, where association is vilified. And it's sort of like both sides want to play a soft cancel culture. And I just don't do that. And when I have people on my show, I am just not. I mean, I probably have a persona on X of being a very disagreeable, argumentative person, but I feel like everyone just comes across that way more on X because you have character limits. You're trying to be short and pithy and get your point across. And yeah, sometimes like if I'm just having a Twitter argument, I'm going to be very blunt to the point and just express where I think someone's wrong, express my viewpoint. But in terms of my personal relationships, I'm agreeable. And when I have someone on my show has never been like a crucible to grill people on and to try to like, thoroughly address every disagreement I could have with them and really break them down and do it in a very adversarial way. I like doing the sort of like combination of finding areas of agreement and then using those like because it's like if you're having a conversation or even a debate with someone and you don't have any common framework to work from, it can be very difficult to make any ground or make any headway. Whereas if you spend time talking to someone and kind of like really nail down the particulars of where you have crossover, where you do have agreement, and you sort of identify, hey, I think that on X, Y, and Z, we're on the same side. We are moving in the same direction. Now, I want to have a conversation about these other things over here where we disagree, and I think that's going to be detrimental to progress on these areas we've identified of agreement. And I do that with everybody, which shouldn't be surprising because I'm a libertarian. And as a libertarian, I tend to find areas of crossover with both left and right. And although I don't like simplifying that to the traditional libertarian tropes of we're neither left or right and we're fiscally conservative and socially liberal, I think that is like a meme, and it's partially a meme because it's overly reductive. But there's a grain of truth there, a kernel of truth that speaks to the fact that libertarianism doesn't, just it for sure does not neatly fall into left or right. It sort of overlaps with both, but also trying to reduce political philosophy to a grid, a two-dimensional grid is also not very helpful. It's almost, I feel like libertarianism is almost creating a third dimension on the grid beyond just authoritarian, libertarian, left and right, which is what typical political grids look like. And they tend to be overly simplistic in that nature. All of this to say, I guess before I dive into the actual meat of my episode, which I'm already 18 minutes into, is that I'm sorry if I don't vilify people you want me to vilify, and I'm sorry if when I have certain people on, I don't nail them on certain things you want me to nail them on, or if I don't, dislike them in the way you dislike them, or even at times if maybe you think someone is treating me in bad faith and I allow them to do that. I'm not playing the game that a lot of people want me to play. And that's true both left and right. And I'm going to, dance to the song of my own. What's the expression? Like I'm going to, you know what I mean? I don't know. I'm not good with these expressions, and I can't think of the one I'm thinking of. March to the beat of my own drum. There we go. That's what I'm looking for. I'm going to march to the beat of my own drum. I'm going to be true to who I am, and I'm not going to fall into audience capture in either direction here. I'm going to do what I think is right. Maybe it's not right, but all I can do is what I'm convicted to do what I think is most beneficial, most valuable. All right. So we're talking about the dissident right. And again, within the dissident right, there are multiple camps. And I'm going to be talking mostly about Christian nationalists here, but certainly this would apply for even some of your MAGA types and and others on the right as well. I think it's one of those things where it starts from a certain stem of Christians and Christian reactionaries and nationalists. And I think that their mindset and sentiment is sort of bleeding out. and so you can see evidence of its influence in the right, more broadly speaking. And again, I don't view the right in the same way that a lot of other libertarians might, or a lot of other critics of Christian nationalism might. So I'm probably, even though I'm punching right here, I'm probably, again, not punching as hard as some people want me to. But here's the concern, is that, and I think this actually is a strong punch, I think a lot of them are distorting the gospel at the end of the day. And I don't necessarily think that they mean to. Some of them might, though. But I feel like there's a problem going on here. And I want to understand where they're coming from, and I've talked to them, and I get it, right? Like, Wolf often is very critical of the MacArthur-style rhetoric you hear from a lot of the opposition to Christian nationalism, which is the "we lose down here" mindset. And I understand that, because even though I am a amillennialist in my eschatology, I don't like the sort of radical two kingdoms mindset that basically says that we spiritualize everything in terms of Christian life and duty, to the extent of which we don't care about this world at all. And all we care about is, oh man, I forgot to mute my phone. I'm sorry. And all we care about is the pursuit of, I guess, like, saving souls. And that's good and fine. But then that's it. It's like we focus on spreading the gospel. We focus on the, growing God's kingdom spiritually, but we don't have any care, or, the world is what it is. And it's kind of weird, right? Like, I want to get into detail about some of the observations I have about this. One of the weird things I've noticed from certain amillennialists is that it almost sounds premillennial in their attitude, which is almost like they expect the world will get worse until the second coming. And I guess, like, they're not, it's not premillennialism because they don't think it's going to be, they do believe that Christ is reigning now. They don't believe in a literal 1,000-year reign in the future, but they react so strongly against postmillennialism that they're like, well, there's no explicit promise that things are going to get better, which I agree with, but they then take it, I think, to too far of an opposite extreme, which is to say that it almost is retreatist. And, there's people I greatly respect who I think have this attitude, who, I think it's not even just even a Christian attitude. I see this among a lot of conservatives, even libertarians, where sometimes it feels like some people are, well, it feels like some people are content to be right and sort of like understand politics, understand current events, understand economics, understand theology, but that's it. Like, they're content to sort of like have a small little niche where they get to be correct about the world. But then it seems like, other than putting out there sort of like the message about, like, here's what's true, they don't seem to be active in trying to shape the world, to try to actually be very proactive in shaping the world to be more in accordance with what is true. So it's like, hey, this is what's true. This is the way that the world should work, but we're not going to do anything to actually try to make things better. On one hand, it's convenient because it allows you to, get a lot of purchase on the ability to sort of like analyze things or what are going on and be critical of them, but then you don't have a lot of skin in the game in terms of actually, well, are your ideas actually good if put into practice? You don't ever have to prove that. You can just criticize. It's sort of like, it's Monday morning quarterback, right? It's like, okay, but can you go out there and do it yourself? And yeah, I do have a little bit of a problem with the mindset of, of we lose down here. And I understand the pushback of that we'll have against radical post-millennialism in terms of, I don't think that there's necessarily a promise of that physically things are going to get better and better here on earth, and that God's kingdom will grow on earth more and more and then culminate. I am amillennial, but I don't think that our job as Christians is to just sort of sit back and just focus on the spiritual aspects of God's kingdom. There are passages that seem to speak to a duty of the church, of the Christian, to try to bring some of what's going on the spiritual sense into the physical reality. And sometimes I feel like, and this is where I have a little bit of appreciation for Eastern Orthodoxy. I feel like sometimes in Protestantism and even maybe in Reformed theology, which I mostly agree with, but sometimes maybe they're making too harsh a division between physical and spiritual. And I'm like, but we should understand that just as we as beings are not, it's not necessarily such a stark difference. I don't think that the world should be viewed through that lens. And I think that there is an importance to trying to make the world better, trying to transform culture, trying to transform legitimate institutions, right? There's some institutions that should be abolished and some that should be reformed or privatized or what have you. And so it doesn't have to be this like false dichotomy between post-millennial futurism and amillennial or premillennial retreatism. There's sort of a third way, if you will, where we can be trying to make the spiritual reign of Christ more visible here on earth, but to understand that still that his reign on earth isn't going to necessarily comport to what the world's understanding of rule and authority is. And so that's sort of the distinction that needs to be made. And so I have disagreements with both of these extremes. And to focus now on to try to conclude this, the problem I see then, because I've laid out where I understand the concerns of some of these Christian reactionaries and nationalists are coming from, because I agree with sort of rejecting the radical retreatist or Anabaptist or radical one version of radical two kingdoms, whether it's premillennial or amillennial. I understand their pushback against that, but then where I think they get it wrong is where maybe some are over spiritualizing or maybe wrong in their eschatology. The Christian reactionary is now going the opposite direction and placing more of an emphasis on institutions and on sort of a nominal or sort of cultural Christianity instead of the actual spreading of the true kingdom of God, which is not grown through law or through institutions, but through the gospel, through people coming one with the body of Christ, which is through a transformation of the heart. It's through, being fishers of men. And I feel like the problem with the one side is they're not trying to make any changes in culture, but then the problem with the Christian reactionary right is they're putting the cart before the horse, and they're trying to get sort of the positive outcomes that you would expect to see from a transformed culture, but they're trying to put the cart before the horse. And and sort of force those outcomes and sort of create, it's like a streets are clean version of Christianity in the world. But I think what that results in, we've seen this in the past, is a nominal Christianity. And I don't think that that lasts. And I think that it actually does great harm to the gospel message. I think that when we try to emphasize sort of the external signs of a Christian culture and not understand that those don't come about through force and coercion very well, at least not long term. And it is sort of a time preference problem, and somewhat of a problem because we already have these institutions of power and nobody seems to want to risk decentralizing power, right? It's a very high time preference mindset, because they go, well, if we don't seize the power and we instead try to play this longer game of reducing and decentralizing these institutions and power structures, then we're just going to be ruled by the other side. But that sort of pre-assumes that you can win. And I feel like more of what we see from this sort of political game that we're playing, whether it's the federal two-party system or even sort of this global apparatus that seems to have emerged as well, it doesn't seem that we ever win. It feels like we make compromises, and by the time we win, the victory doesn't actually even look like what the goals that were set out to be obtained were defined as in the first place. The kingdoms of man and these power structures are not as easily malleable in their design as a lot of the Christian reactionaries tend to think they are. And also there's an opportunity cost, because all the time spent trying to create this sort of external Christian nationalism, this, Christian rule or reign that through the culture and institutions artificially through using law and using institutions to sort of impose those norms. Well, you can't just set it in place and let it go. You have to set it and then maintain it. And in a democracy, that means constantly spending tons of time and millions and billions really of dollars and all of this into maintaining that power even after you get it. And that's usually going to come with compromise, right? Because then to get the money to stay in power, you're going to have to make deals with lobbyists and make deals with special interest groups. And suddenly your agenda is now 50 different agendas boiled into one. And so this is the problem. I know some Christian reactionaries dream or they reminisce about Christian monarchy, but at that point, what's more realistic? Christian libertarianism or a return to Christian monarchism in our society? And it's not as if the monarchy is a cure-all to this problem, because you still have a problem of maintaining the royal lineage and things like that. So you can maybe not quite the same problems of holding power in a democracy, but it still has its own set of problems. There's usually a whitewashed version of history by these Christian nationalists and reactionaries when they look back to the monarchs of both, the Byzantines and the monarchs in Europe and in the West. But even going beyond that, we'll just look to biblical history, and we just see that then we're repeating the same mistakes that have been made of trying to use a king and trying to use a kingdom and law to create a moral people when that never succeeded. I mean, God gave the Jewish people a law given to them by him. He crafted the law and he chose the kings, and it still didn't succeed. And the kingdom split, and it had all sorts of problems. All the problems that existed in Israel before the monarch in the book of Judges persisted and were worsened by the institution of the monarchy. And so, again, there's a bit of utopianism going on, where instead of accepting that, yes, decentralization of power does lead to problems, it's always compared to what, right? It's not compared to the ideal utopia that you think you can create. It's, how can we minimize the negative trade-offs and maximize the positive ones? And how can we maximize the influence and role of the church in society? And that's usually not by maximizing the power of a king or the state. And so that's sort of the broad theme that has been present throughout some of the previous interactions I've had with these people. And although I understand what's motivating a lot of them, they're getting the solutions wrong. And so I'm going to be focusing into some different specific aspects of this, overall topic here going forward. So that's all I have for you guys today. I appreciate you sticking with me through all this. Please make sure you like and subscribe if you are on YouTube and Rumble or anything like that. And if you're on a podcatcher, please leave a 5-star review, a written review if you can, and that helps us out a lot. And that's all I have for you guys. Remember to live counterculture to the empire of man, to live for Christ, and live at peace. Take care. Talk to you next time.
The Biblical Anarchy Podcast is a part of the Christians for Liberty Network, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute. If you love this podcast, it helps us reach more with a message of freedom when you rate and review us on your favorite podcast apps and share with others. If you want to support the production of the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, please consider donating to the Libertarian Christian Institute at biblicalanarchypodcast.com, where you can also sign up to receive special announcements and resources related to biblical anarchy. Thanks for tuning in.